Biblical law categorizes a fetus as property and not as a person. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. If we look in the Covenant Code, specifically Exodus 21 verses 22 through 25, we see some guidance regarding what to do if two men who are fighting accidentally injure a pregnant woman. And there are two outcomes, and each has a penalty. The first outcome is that the injury induces a miscarriage, but there is no further harm, Hebrew ason, tragedy, that comes to the woman. And in that case, the husband assesses a fine, and there are arbitrators there to ensure that it is not exorbitant. The other outcome is that there is ason, tragedy, harm that comes to the woman, in which case talionic justice, retaliatory justice comes into play. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and so on. And what this means is that the person has done harm to a legal person, and so the same harm is then done to the perpetrator. And what this indicates is that a fetus was not viewed as a person. It was viewed more as property. And there is other person/property legislation in this chapter. An enslaved person, for instance, is between property and person. But it has a standardized value assigned to the enslaved person, 30 shekels. The fetus does not have a standard value. The husband gets to decide what value to place on the fetus, and arbitrators are there to ensure that it is not exorbitant. So a fetus was even more property and less person than an enslaved person. Now, a lot of conservative folks recognize the implications of this reading to contemporary right-wing authoritarian identity politics, and so are incentivized to find another reading. And this alternative reading that has been developed is that the first outcome is actually not miscarriage, but the inducing of premature birth that results in no further harm to the fetus, a healthy premature birth. The second outcome is where there is further harm to the fetus, in other words, the miscarriage, in which case talionic justice comes into play. And there are three reasons that this is a weak and a dogmatic argument. The first is that it is based on the notion that the verbal root yatsah probably refers to normal birth, because it is frequently used to refer to normal birth. Although usually the context is clear that this is a normal birth, but there are a couple of additional problems. One is that yatsah can also be found in reference to stillbirth and miscarriage. The other is that this is not a normal birth. This is an injury-induced premature birth, and so we would expect more in the context. As the Hebrew word stands, it is not determinative in and of itself. And this brings up the second reason this is a weak reading. There is no reason for a fine to be imposed when there is no material loss. To induce a premature birth that results in no further harm to the infant is not a finable offense according to the logic of the legislation of the Hebrew Bible. That would be entirely unique. The third reason is most convincing, however, and that is that the Covenant Code is not making these laws up from nowhere. They're certainly not falling ex nihilo from the heavens. They are being adapted from Hammurabi's laws. And David Wright makes a very convincing, very thorough argument for this in his book, Inventing God's Law. Now, this passage is drawing from laws 209 and 210 from Hammurabi's laws. And according to those laws, if a man beats another man's daughter and causes her to miscarry, he's on the hook for 10 shekels. If a man beats another man's daughter and she dies, then that man's daughter is killed. And so that is the talionic, the retaliatory justice. And there are actually other law codes in Mesopotamia, the Neo-Assyrian laws, Hittite laws, and others that also have laws about what to do if a man causes a woman to miscarry or causes her to die. So this is a standardized piece of legislation that was passed around ancient Southwest Asia that is being picked up and adapted by the authors of the Covenant Code. And those laws all address the same two outcomes. Causes a miscarriage, causes the woman to die. There is no law anywhere that imposes any penalty whatsoever for causing a pregnant woman to prematurely give birth to a healthy infant. And so this argument is weak, it is dogmatic, and for those reasons, the majority of scholars have not been convinced by it. Now, there is an interesting difference in the way that the ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint, renders this passage. For whatever reason, probably has to do with the influence of Greek philosophy, they understand ason, this word that means tragedy, in relation to the Greek word soma, body. And so they render it to say, if there is no body, then there is a fine. But if there is a body, then it is life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. In other words, if the fetus is not fully developed yet, it's only a fine. If it is fully developed, then the death penalty comes into view. So the idea here is that once fetal development has progressed far enough, then the fetus takes on personhood. And this is related to Greek philosophical ideas of ensoulment, when a soul enters a body and that entity then becomes a person. The Pythagoreans and the Epicureans said that this happened at conception. The Aristotelians said that this happened at the quickening, when the fetus begins to move on its own and the mother can feel those movements. The Stoics said that it happened at birth, once the newborn came into contact with the outside air. And for the first couple of centuries of Christianity, there were debates about which of these they were going to stick with. And by the 4th century CE, they had all settled on the Aristotelian view that personhood was achieved at the quickening. And so Christianity, up until the 19th century, understood abortion to only become murder at the quickening, because that is when ensoulment took place. And it was in the 19th century, for a few different reasons, that people began to say, no, we're going to take it all the way back to conception.